Support for the Civic SciTV network comes from listeners and viewers like you and organizations such as the Rita Allen Foundation, which invests in transformative ideas in their earliest stages to leverage their growth and promote breakthrough solutions to significant problems. Go to ritaallen.org to learn more.
Mapping the global landscape of civic science by dissecting new insights from researchers, practitioners, and leaders in academia, government, for-profit, and non-profit organizations. This is Questions of the Day with Fanuel Muindi.
Previously on Questions of the Day.
Boundary spanning is what we do in civic science. We're connectors, right? We're spanning these boundaries that seem to have persisted, maybe I should say, between research and communities. And that's kind of the sweet spot where I've been working for over 20 years. And I was just remembering earlier today, a meeting that was probably close to 20 years ago where other people like me doing similar kinds of work, we were trying to figure out what to call ourselves. And I think back then all we could come up with was facilitator. And so I've never really had a good title until now that explains, doesn't explain boundaries between what and what, right? But it does explain this idea that it's across a boundary. And that's what civic science is about.
En el Instituto de Tecnología de Massachusetts. O sea, MIT. El cerebro es algo súper fácil. El cerebro es algo increíble. Que realmente es eso.
Que realmente no sabemos.
No sabemos.
Quiero saber más.
Quiero saber más. Claro, y te lo explico aunque sea con mi última neurona.
What you just saw and heard is the opening sequence of Mi Última Neurona, a Spanish neuroscience podcast, hosted by Jessica Chomik-Morales. In this conversation, we take a deep dive into the podcast and learn about its goals, approach, and the lessons Jessica has been learning along the way.
Jessica Chomik-Morales, welcome to Questions of the Day.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, you're the host of Mi Última Neurona, and I came across this podcast of yours that focuses on the Spanish-speaking community when I was just strolling around the internet, the YouTube, and I saw your 1-minute interviews, and then through search, I found your podcast, and I was just so impressed, and I wanted to talk to you to learn more about the work. So take us back, Jessica. How did you start Mi Última Neurona? Why in particular did you start it?
I started it because I really felt in that time that I only had, so the meaning of the name in Spanish could equate to my last brain cell. And at that time, I was starting a postbac as a postbac researcher here at MIT. And I really felt, that the learning curve was pretty steep. I was under a lot of, stress. I really felt like I only had one of my brain cells working. That's where the name was inspired. But the reason for the actual show is because my mom, and I've told this story many times, really thought I was a neurologist. And she kept asking me, when are you going to start your career? When are you going to start seeing patients? I had some cousins ask me or send me kind of like neuro images, whether it be like MRI images or, EEG recordings of their kids and being like, hey, can you tell me if this looks normal to you? And I was like, well, no, guys, I study the brain. I don't treat it. So I wanted to get more in touch with the Latin community here at MIT. As it turns out, there's not very many Latinos in STEM in general, but more so even in neuroscience. So I kind of like rounded everybody up that I could, and I started just talking to them like, well, what do you do? And tell me as if you were telling your grandma back in Puerto Rico or back in Colombia or in Mexico. And that project kind of picked up more and more of a following, and I realized that people actually do care about this and are interested. Neuroscience isn't really something we frequently talk about in Latin communities, but it more and more people, because information is becoming more accessible, like they're getting interested into it.
Yeah. Now, before we get deeper into your podcast, I want to learn more about you. So you're a graduate student right now at MIT. Tell us about that and just your background.
So I actually transitioned careers from cognitive neuroscience, which is what my bachelor's and my 3 years as a scientist here at MIT were all about. And I transitioned into a master's in science journalism here because I feel that I'm making more of an immediate impact into my community doing that work. And as a grad student, I'm currently taking classes on all the different ways that one can communicate science. So whether it be through an investigative reporting where you get to the bottom of something, some phenomenon that's happening in a community and you figure out why that's happening, or writing opinion pieces or creating documentaries or even podcasting, and of course news articles. So I'm getting the formal training in how it is to how does one effectively and efficiently communicate these very dense topics that a lot of people's eyes kind of glaze over when they read these headlines.
Yeah. So are you, just to be sure, are you in the program, the writing program? Is that what?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. 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 So I think I'm always curious about the backgrounds, right? How do people get into, especially doing podcasts? Now there are a lot of podcasts, right? And tell me what makes yours different. I know you do your interviews completely in Spanish. Tell us more. What else makes your interviews, podcasts different?
Hmm. I think okay. I think the answer would be is that I'm relatively young in this field. So, you all people who normally have some kind of lecture series online or maybe even podcasts are people who have PhDs, who have been tenured professors. There's Andrew Huberman, who is this very famous neuroscience professor out of Stanford, and he's got this huge platform of neuroscience where he goes very in depth into, the biology of several neuroscientific topics. But I think what makes mine different is that one, like you said, it is completely in Spanish, and there is no other podcast in the sphere of neuroscience in this style. This is the only one. Um, Another reason is that because I'm so young and naive, I come from this perspective of asking dumb questions. I'm always asking dumb questions. I'm not an expert even in cognitive neuroscience, which is what my background is in. So whenever I interview people of at the different layers that one can study the brain or the central nervous system from, I'm always asking the questions that the audience would want to know more about. So yeah, tell me about your really interesting protein or this really cool region of the brain, but also how the hell are you measuring this? Or, what are you doing? Why is this important? How does this relate back to me or humanity as a whole? And I think that that's a lot of my listeners appreciate that. Another thing is I always ask for the stories of these scientists. So I want to know what their struggles were to get to where they are. I don't want to just know what they're doing now, why they're great now. I want to know what town did they come from. Some of the scientists that I interview came from affluent families who lived in big cities like Buenos Aires or Ciudad de Mexico. And other scientists, come from rural areas of our Latin American countries where there weren't resources, and they still were able to get to the professorships that they're at now and still are creating this awesome science. I think there's this myth floating around that in order to do good science or to be someone in the academic sphere, you have to go to the US or Europe, and you have to leave your home country. And time again, throughout all of my interviews, I'm proving that that's not the case. And these scientists are proving that that's not the case because they're not only doing research out of their home countries, but, they're also doing it in Spanish. They're publishing, they're trying to make science more accessible. They're using advanced technologies. Some of the most incredible labs I've ever seen have actually been in Ciudad de Mexico, in Mexico City. Top tier institution in Querétaro. I was beside myself. And so, yeah, I think that's where it's a little different, is that the personal stories of these scientists are also interleaved.
So you do both the science and the personal stories as well. And this reminds me of, Professor Weijima at NYU, he does these growing up in science, not seminars, but talks where scientists begin by talking about their personal stories, their human stories in science first before the science, which is really fascinating. Now, just to be clear, so the scientists you're talking to are also Spanish-speaking scientists. That they're based in Spanish-speaking countries. Is that right?
Well, the first season was all in Cambridge because
I see.
they were easy. But then, because I got sponsorship from several departments here at MIT, for the second season, I went to Puerto Rico and went around the island and to 4, 5 cities, I think, to interview scientists there because I wanted to see, okay, so we have people who immigrated from their countries to do science here. Let's go to a US territory, which is still going to be different. Like it's a US territory, but the resources they have is still going to be different. So what's happening over there? How are they doing it there? That became popular. Those episodes, as the podcast grew in listeners, MIT continued their funding, and I was able to actually travel to 7 countries in Latin America to interview neuroscientists in all those countries. So it was Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, which is my home country.
Wow, that sounds like a fun, well, both fun and a lot of work also, right?
Yeah, it was incredible.
So with that, tell us what have your audiences been telling you from doing this work? What kind of feedback are you getting? Can you give us the highlights?
The highlights, oh my gosh. I think I've only gotten 2 haters in my whole time of doing this. And I don't think a lot of, internet people can say that. So I feel very fortunate. I have gotten some of the most, this is, I think, the reason why is because of the listener feedback that I've gotten is why I am now dedicating my life to communicating science for now. I don't know, maybe it'll change, but I'll give you 2 different anecdotes. The first, when I went on this tour, Latin American tour, the final stop was my home country. And it was very difficult to find neuroscientists there. I only know of 3, and at the time I didn't know of any. And this was after trying to get in contact with universities down there and speaking to a lot of people. And it was pretty disheartening. But when I went down there, I was invited to give some talks at medical schools. And at the second medical school I gave a talk to, they were neurology students, but I was telling them what it is to study the brain as opposed to treating it. And, it was like news. And I remember I promoted this event publicly on the podcast website and everything. And the last person in line to ask me questions after my talk was this woman who kind of was like very sheepish. And she approached and she was like, "It's nice to meet you. My name is so-and-so. I've actually traveled 2 hours to come listen to you." And I was like, I was like 23 at the time. I was like, me? Of all people? I don't know anything. And she said that because of one of the episodes I had published, of one of the conversations I had with a neuroscientist about autism, that a lot of things started clicking for her. And she actually went and got a diagnosis at 32 years old and was diagnosed with autism after struggling with it for so long. And having trouble interacting with other people socially and wondering if there was something wrong with her and why she couldn't understand jokes, for instance. And so that was very impactful for me. She told me that she actually, because of this, now teaches her students, because she's a teacher, about neurodiversity, and she's always on the lookout, for, are there students who are struggling with paying attention? Are there students who are hyperactive? Are there students who are maybe falling behind in some activities? Why is it? Like, what can we do to support these kids? And these are conversations that don't happen in Latin America. Like, they're starting to now. But, growing up, even myself, to immigrant Latin parents, it's like you sit down and you do your work and you better not be hyperactive. So that was really moving. And in the other anecdote I want to tell is about some this girl from Colombia saw one of my TikTok videos, and in a TikTok I was talking about, I went to this university in South Florida, and this is where I got my degree, and now I'm at MIT. And she was like, you know what? I'm studying psychology, but I've always been interested in the biological basis of behavior. Like maybe I should study neuroscience. And you know what? I'm going to apply to the same school you went to. And she was accepted. And I went down to my school to give a talk, and I happened to run into her. And, it was this feeling of personal fulfillment. Like I've done something. For some people, maybe it was only a handful, but like I've changed somebody's life for the better. Yeah, I think the feedback that I get is very, very good.
Yeah, and we hear a lot that tracking impact is actually very difficult, right? You'll get these anecdotes here and there. I'm curious, how have you approached this? You mentioned you have some funding from McGovern. What did they look for in terms of impact, and how are you communicating the impact of your podcast to them and others who may be interested in supporting your work?
Well, there's definitely numbers, right? You can look at how many listeners I have and how many followers I have across platforms. So you can look at, Spotify. The most recent, so the third season is a style shift from the first two. The first two were only audio, and they were very much produced like with audio engineering, with sound effects, with background, very Radio Lab-esque, because that was my inspiration. In the third season, I think that it was important for people to be able to put faces to these scientists. So there's not as much production anymore. It's very kind of like more straightforward conversation, but now you can see who's talking, you can see what they look like. People, kids especially, can like visualize like, oh, this person looks like me, or this person kind of talks with like the same accent I talk with. So yeah, on YouTube we have like, I think it's like 1,200 followers. On Spotify we have much more. I think it's closer to like 16,000. And then we have like our Instagram followers. And so all of these numbers, and also like how long people listen to each episode. Are most people only listening to the first 15 minutes, if that, or people, the majority of them staying until the end? I have about 65% of my listeners stay until the very end, which I think that's pretty good. My episodes are about an hour long. Sorry?
It's sticky if they're sticking around and listening.
It must be, yeah. And these are long episodes. They're not like, they're not 20-minute or 15. They're an hour at least usually. So that's a pretty good sign for me.
Yeah. But and I think you mentioned that those two anecdotes, and this is the hard part, right? Tracking those like behavioral changes, right? Where something fundamental changing, right, in the way they're doing something. Do you anticipate, or have you thought about doing surveys of some kind to really capture those insights? Maybe you've done that, or tell us about that.
Yes, thank God I have a social media manager who helps me now with, engagement and the audience, because it's a full-time job to do that, especially when you have to navigate the algorithms and stuff. So I know she definitely does these polls, like what do you want to learn about next, or which topics in this episode did you most resonate with, or what did you find most interesting? We did have a giveaway of, I don't know if I have it here, but anyways, it was this handmade item that an indigenous person made in Paraguay. They're called the Guarani tribe, and they have this threading that's called ñanduti, and it means spiderweb in Guarani, which is our second native language. When we did that giveaway, it wasn't just like anyone who likes the podcast gets it. It's like, which episode was your favorite and why? And so in those comments, when people were tagging other, their friends trying to win this thing, we learned a lot about what people are really motivated by. And what I saw was that people love a good story. You could have the best, most interesting science, you could have this cool new technology, but if the person that's telling you about it is not moving in some way, is not convincing, or is not inspiring, usually those episodes don't perform that well. In fact, one of my most well-performing episodes is with this computational neuroscience, Josefina Cruzat from Chile. And there's this one clip that went viral, and it was basically her saying that she went into a computational neuroscience lab not knowing how to code. And that is just mind blowing, even to me, because that it's like you're going into a PhD, computational neuroscience PhD, not knowing how to code. And she did it. And she was able to learn. And that was inspiring for listeners. So we got a lot of feedback like, this episode really inspired me because of this, or I really liked the way this neuroscientist portrayed his findings.
Yeah. I think it's great. Thank you for sharing this, right? Because a lot of times it's also hard to communicate and share what these impacts are, right? And so forth. And these algorithms are changing, right? YouTube is changing and all the TikToks and so forth, right? So you are adapting also. Tell me, how did you come to learn about all these things? Or, you're now in the graduate program in the writing, right? Mostly focusing on writing, but how have you incorporated what you've learned both formally and informally to doing this?
The podcast.
Yeah, the podcast. That's right.
A lot of it was just I hate to say it, but intuitive. I listened to a lot of Radiolab. That was what really inspired me as an undergrad. How I was just stuck in these stories. I would be going on my daily walks through Fenway Park when I was at Northeastern for my first year, and just listening to the stories that they were telling me, and completely absorbed. I was completely absorbed in this other world that was created through sound alone. No visual input. My brain is creating this imaginary scenario. I'm listening to these voices explain this cool octopus or something. And I was like, and somehow I learned we're pattern recognizers, right? That's what humans are. We recognize patterns. Somehow I recognize these patterns, like, okay, in order to keep a view or a listener engaged, you need to have you need dynamic movement. You need to build a soundscape. Every podcast is a different way of doing this, different style, but you need to be able to keep somebody there by kind of inching them along the narrative. And so a lot of it comes from me reading a lot as well, growing up. Now, more formally, which is what I needed, my podcast style is still going to be played with. I'm still going to find, what the best way is. But I think in terms of writing, that's something that I really needed to better, because if you're a good writer, if you know how to put your thoughts to paper in a cohesive, efficient way, if you're able to convey something in of complex nature through your writing in an artistic way, then I think everything else just kind of falls into place.
Yeah, and the things that you mentioned that you learned by doing, right? You started and you learn on the job, really, right? Because I think sometimes that could be a barrier for some people where they're thinking, oh, I need to have X, Y, and Z lined up or training to do it, but you just start to learn, right, and adapt along the way. Now, when we come back, I'm going to ask Jessica about the challenges and advice for others who may be interested in starting something like this, right, in their own local language. So don't go away.
SciComm is a communications company built for scientists by me, a scientist. SciComm works directly with academic researchers, tech companies, nonprofits, and any scientists to create clear, engaging, scientifically accurate media. Whether you need a whiteboard video to teach your audience something new, an animated explainer video that breaks down your complex work into something that's easier to understand, visually compelling slides for an upcoming presentation, a blog article to inform your readers of the latest research in your field, or even just a simple illustration, SciComm is your communications partner. Simplify your science with SciComm.
Welcome back. So Jessica, doing this work, I can imagine hasn't been easy. Earlier you told us you did this whole tour of South America, right? What have been some of the most challenging things about doing this work so far?
Time management. It's not, there's a lot of steps. I was fortunate enough when I started to have a good friend of mine from undergrad helped me with audio. So I'm not an audio designer. I know basics based on YouTube videos that I've watched, but really cleaning up the audio so that, the voice is crisp. Nobody wants to listen to kind of like these cracklings in the background or something that sounds like a phone call. It's way easier to listen to a narrator whose voice you like as well. So things like that, I didn't have to have the learning curve because somebody was there. But there's also like storyboarding an episode and, finding people to interview. That was one of the greatest challenges with both the Latin American tour, LATAM tour for season 3, and then my most recent tour in Spain, which was just recorded in the month of August, which is going to come out January 1st. But that was, being able to not only find Spanish speaking neuroscientists, that's so niche, but also doing interesting things. And by interesting, I'm not saying that not like there are things that are not interesting. I'm saying what is interesting to the public. Sure, there might be protein crystallizations that are like so amazing and new and definitely relevant and definitely important, but it's much harder to build a story about protein crystallization than it is about perhaps the different learning differences among people with autism or aspects of Alzheimer's, things that we can connect back to people ultimately. So it was, there's many filters. There's, okay, has to be Spanish speaking, has to be related to neuro in some way, whether it be from an engineering perspective, like you're designing tools that help neuroscientists, you are a neuroscientist, or you work with the brain in a medical field of some type. All of it has to come back because that's the niche that I work with. And then it's like you have to do interesting stuff. And then on top of that, you have to actually be good at talking, because that's what I've learned the hard way through the podcast. But sometimes, they might pass all these filters, but then, they're not very outgoing. So you kind of have to like draw out their personality. And part of that is being a good interviewer, which is something that I've, learned by doing. It's, how do you make somebody feel comfortable with being themselves when they're talking about their science, of like really projecting who they really are. And then after that, are they doing, I know it's like all of these things, but are they doing good science? Are they being published in reputable journals? What's their methodology? I'm like, it would be tragic to highlight the work of somebody who is doing bad science. That would reflect poorly on me and other people who are science communicators. That's something that you have to be very careful about. And something that we're trained in, of course, my program is like, okay, even if I'm not an astrophysicist, what things in the methodology can I look for to kind of fact check, to make sure that things were done in an appropriate way? Are the variables controlled? All these aspects of like science that you think about, but it's like you have to actually go and do the work and make sure. So at the end of all of that, I did end up interviewing 33 neuroscientists on that LATAM tour, which is a lot. Of course, I went to a lot of different places, but it wasn't 33 at the beginning. It was more like 100, 200 people that Dr. Hector de Jesus Cortés, who is the scientific advisor of the podcast, and I sifted through so many people in order to get down to those 33. And then of those 33 recordings, actually only 29 are going to be published. So yeah, there's many steps. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, and you mentioned fact checking, right? Because in your podcast you're talking also about the science. I just want to reiterate this. Like you go in depth into the science, and you're doing this completely in Spanish, of course, right? To remind the viewers, you're doing this completely in Spanish, and I just love that whole pipeline that you have there, right? That you go through and you do your diligence, and you mentioned that you're not doing this alone. You have an advisor in play, right? Tell us about the team, because I imagine that's another part of the challenge maybe for some might be thinking about, right? How do I build a team to do this effectively?
This is something I think life has taught me. I don't necessarily think it's like a business practice. I'm sure they teach it in business school too. But if you have people who believe very strongly in the same goal, it's going to be much easier to work than it is than if you're just paying somebody to do something. I had to learn that in many different aspects. I am not a natural leader. I wasn't trained to be a producer, but I did learn, I know something about how people work. And so I was like, you know what? I don't know how to do audio, but my friend does, and he's pretty good at it. And, we get along. and he's also from Puerto Rico. So it's like, okay, let me ask him and we'll talk about it. And so then it's like, here, this is what I can do. I don't have that many resources, but we both believe in the same thing. And so, okay, you're on my team. And then I talked with Hector, and he's a really strong proponent of like diversity and equity, especially in the Latin community of science. And he's doing huge things in Puerto Rico now as well. So he was like, I believe in your project. I'm a more senior, he was a postdoc at MIT. He's like, I'm a more senior neuroscientist. I will help you with this aspect. Okay, great. Then I was like, I'm overwhelmed by social media. I'm not, the influencer type. I don't have that constant on personality. I need somebody to be able to, make sure the DMs are being checked, make sure that we're posting, make sure we're keeping up with the algorithm and all the, audience influxes. So I was like, okay, somebody can do that. She's from Chile. She also believes in the project. She's affiliated with universities. Then there's a video editor, because as I could learn, and I know how to do it, but it's like I can't do big picture and the details. Yeah. So for me, it's really important to have a team that all believes in the same goal. With very passionately, because there are times when the money may run out, but passion doesn't.
Yeah. Because that's another thing to keeping it going, right? How are you keeping it going? Because you're in school and you really are doing this on the side, right?
Yes.
And then you mentioned earlier that you've found your calling by doing this work. You've found your calling, that you hope that it stays there and you can do something about it in the long term, right? So how do you see that, like the sustainability of this in the long term? You've done your third season, right? LATAM is coming out in January. Thank you for announcing that. People are going to
Spain tour. Right? Spain. Yeah.
I'm excited already, right? And for those who are worried that it's completely in Spanish, I mean, you can just turn on the captions in English and have a listen. They're pretty good. I was able to follow and read them really fast. Feedback.
Yeah, actually, well, we're adding our own transcription of English captions. Yeah, because actually ChatGPT is much better than whatever generator they have. So we're going to upload those. So that was one of some feedback I got from my English speaking friends. It's like, we'd love to support you, but we don't understand what you're saying.
Yeah, because that's the thing, right? I think the audience here, it can be global, right? In the sense that there are others who are curious about this as well. So advice now, Jessica, for those who want to do this in their own local languages. We've talked to a few African podcasters actually, right, who have mentioned this, and researchers who have thought about, okay, I think targeting the audience in their own local language is very, very important, right? The majority of podcasts are in English, right?
Yeah.
And so
most scientific publications are. I think it's 98%.
And the issue just exactly, they keep on going. What's your advice there, especially with this language barriers that are in place?
Well, it is very useful to be bilingual in your native language and in English. I think that's what gives me an edge. So because I grew up speaking only in English to my dad and only in Spanish to my mom, I am truly bilingual. I understand just as much in English as I do in Spanish. And that has allowed me to be this bridge between an English-speaking academic world and a Spanish-speaking layperson. In order to digest science, so if we're talking about science communication here, in order to be that intermediate, the advice I would give is you don't have to be a scientist by training to translate science, but you have to be good at translating both scientific jargon to lay terms and also from one language to the other. My advice on how to do that is to read a lot. I wish my advice was more, you could do this one trick and overnight you're going to be better at communicating. But the truth is, I think the more input you have, just like let's take a large language model, for instance.
Right.
It is a bell curve, right? There is too much training where it's unnecessary and inefficient. But, there is a point of training you have to reach, even for a large language model, on content, such that you know what patterns to pick up on, what to what you're noticing, not only about how things are spoken about and things are done in the scientific community, but also how people consume science. So you have to be at both ends. How is it being produced? What are the patterns there? And how are people consuming it? It's like if you know a lot about science, but nothing about the audience, that's not helpful, or vice versa, right?
Yeah, and that feedback and advice is so important, right? Know your audience, right? Go and actually spend time to understand what they are looking for, what are their pain points, right? And how you can address it. Let me ask that same question in a slightly different way. If you were to go back, is there something that you would do differently in launching this?
No. I would not have learned the lessons I've learned had I not made those mistakes. So they had to be done.
So in this case, the mistakes that were important, right, along the way.
Always. If you were to ask that same question about my life, I would say the same thing.
Because if you didn't make those mistakes, then you wouldn't have learned the lessons that.
Exactly. And it's not enough for your parents or your educators to tell you, look, you're going to make a mistake if you do this. It's really not.
Yeah, and it goes back to the earlier point, just starting, right? Even if you kind of don't know all the pieces, because there are things that you are still learning, right? And you're in that mode to learn, right? So that you can continue to adapt the show and grow it over time.
That's why when we were talking before the show started, of these professors and academics that, are kind of in their 80s or even 90s and they're still working and they still have labs. And what I said was, well, you can't retire from thinking. So, you're always learning something.
Jessica, 30 seconds. Sadly, my goodness, time goes by so quickly. And so as we talked offline earlier, we're going to have you back. This is today is setting the stage, right? To just understand what you're doing, and then we can go deeper in future episodes. I'm curious, what's the future? What do you hope for this podcast in the next, whatever time frame you want, 2, 3, 4, 5 years?
I'm hoping it becomes much more than just a podcast. I don't want to say just a podcast because it's important. It's done a lot, but I want it to be a movement in neuroscience. I'd love to become the face of neuroscience being done in Latin communities, really. And I'd love for the podcast to be a resource for students, even in the classroom. Like perhaps there's a way to make these episodes maybe even shorter, maybe a spin-off series or something like that, where, it's more fun to learn about neuroscience than flipping through your textbook. You could just, hey, you have this podcast, you go listen to it and then tell us what you liked about it. It'd be great to have a show, a TV show of some sort. I think that's my next 5-year plan is to have a TV show for Mi Última Neurona.
Well, you heard it here first. Jessica Chomik-Morales, thank you so much.
Thank you.